Who is Jesus? If you ask that question of a lot of people out in the world who may not, even though they may have a Bible, they may not have a real understanding of who Jesus is. There's a lot of misconceptions about who Jesus is. To those people who don't read that much, they probably conclude that Jesus, being such a loving individual, got along with everybody. That could be further from the truth. Because when you do read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you read of a tremendous amount of conflict that Jesus faced. That would be surprising, especially when you get, like, for example, Matthew chapter 27, when Pilate offered Jews there a choice between Barabbas and Jesus, who should let go. To his surprise and dismay, they said, "Let Barabbas go. What then shall I do with Jesus called Christ?" It's asked in Matthew 27, verse 22, and his surprise was, "Let him be crucified." How did that happen? Here's a nation that had been awaiting the coming of the Messiah for hundreds of years, and then when he showed up, all of his wisdom and compassion and glory, they rejected it. Why so? One of the things about the scriptures, we get to see truth laid out, what that sounds like. We also get to see those who would be classified opponents to the truth. Why are they there? Well, it provides an idea of what anybody who's going to be a follower of Jesus in any age. People are really no different today than what they were back then. So in answer to the question, why would Jesus be rejected? Well, let's just start looking at some things, and I think you'll see one big area of tension that took place. Matthew chapter 12, there's a controversy that develops over the Sabbath. Let's begin reading at verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now when he had departed from there, he went into the synagogue. Behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" that they might accuse him. Then he said to them, "What man is there among who has one sheep? If it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not lay hand of it and lift it out? How much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. Why get so upset? Well, the problem was they had their tradition. Even though the law of Moses had been easily explained and understood by reading the 5 books of the Pentateuch, especially Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and all the things that had to explain it, the intent of the law, by the time Jesus arrived on the scene, the Jewish people hierarchy had developed such an elaborate system of traditions that really violated the truth of what the scriptures inferred and implied. And so they had anybody that violated their set of traditions was in trouble. Jesus did that. And some of the more elaborate traditions that really upset people back then had to do with Sabbath day traditions. And Jesus violated that. So when his disciples violate their tradition of Sabbath, they get upset. And Jesus intentionally brings up a situation after teaching on the subject of someone asking, would it be okay to take care of an animal, pull out the dish? Yes. How about healing somebody? And he heals somebody intentionally. Some people may think he's trying to inflame the situation, but what he's doing is teaching the truth. So here you see what the big issue is, whether or not they were going to follow the truth or tradition. And that's still the same thing that we face today. A lot of people have their own religious traditions that mean everything to them. And if you show them the truth of God's word, they can. Sometimes people do change, but oftentimes they do not. So really it's the same issue there. Another example in Matthew chapter 15, a glaring example of how the traditions meant so much to those people, what they believed about religion and the application of it. In Matthew chapter 15, there's a debate, again over tradition. Verse 1. Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands when they eat bread?" He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me as a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Here we see people who are blinded by their tradition. They're all upset because they notice that Jesus does not, his disciples don't wash their hands. They get called out on that. So Jesus calls them out. Most of you that know the background behind what they were doing, here was a loophole, basically, for financial gain. Most of the people realized back then that there was no Social Security, and so it would fall upon the children, especially the firstborn son, to provide financial wherewithal when mom and dad got too old to be taken care of. Then they'll be provided by their children, which only makes sense. What some of the people though had done with that money, they had donated it to the temple, and what some of the priests were doing, loaning that out. There were kickbacks and all kinds of things. And so it got to the point when mom and dad needed the money, the wherewithal, they'd tell them, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you. We're giving that to the temple. And Jesus pointed out how absurd they are in condemning his own disciples not washing their hands. And they were letting dear old mom and dad go hungry. And he called them what they were. And they took a prophecy, as Jesus did from Isaiah, talking about the hypocrites that would exist one day. He said, this passage applies to you. And no doubt that would inflame them, and it did, even more so. And the result of that, look at verse 10. When he had called the multitudes to himself, he said to them, Hear and understand, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a man. Then his disciples came and said to him, Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard these things? So your disciples are worried about wanting to be politically acceptable and said, People don't talk about these people like that, but Jesus did. He answered and said, Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They're blind leaders of the blind. If the blind leads the blind, they both will fall into the ditch. So here Jesus condemns heartily, again, people who have so embraced tradition, they blind themselves to the truth. And Jesus made the point. When you worship God with that attitude, mind, it's useless. It's vain. So here we see another passage that relates to worship. How we live our lives affects our worship of God. We can't live life any way that we want. For us to be able to worship God, as John chapter 4, verse 24 says, it must be in spirit and in truth. There's a right manner. And the attitude of life that we have prior to coming to worship is all important. How we live our lives, whether we're following the scriptures or not, determines whether or not our lives are going to be accepted in worship. Another glaring example of a conflict that took place between Jesus and some of the traditions of the scribes and Pharisees. Look at John chapter 8, the passage read for you just a moment ago. John chapter 8. Verse 31 beginning, Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, If you abide in my word, you're my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They answered him, We're Abraham's descendants, have never been in bondage to anyone. That's a foolish statement. knowing the history of Israel. How can you say you will be made free? Jesus answered them, most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. Now, these are words that should be received openly and with cheerfulness on the part of those who heard it. Not these people. They're so enraged by what Jesus is saying. Well, look what takes place. Verse 30, I know that you're Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. I speak what I have seen with my father. You do what you've seen with your father. I wonder who he's talking about. Well, we'll see. The answer said to him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me, a man who's told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. So here again, he's pointing out the major conflict between truth, which Jesus shared, and the tradition, which the people that day had embraced. You do the deeds of your father. And they said to him, we were not born of fornication, implying Jesus' virgin birth. We have one Father, God. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you're not able to listen to my word. Then look at verse 44. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he's a liar and the father of it. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears God's words. Therefore you do not hear, because you're not of God. So here are people Jesus convicts, openly, convicts them. Their problem, they care more about the traditions than the truth. And people are like that today. There are a lot of people who claim to be religious, who have various forms of, uh, of denominations and so forth that they've concocted on their own, and they love those more than the truth themselves. And so, why are these things here? To prepare us and to help us to understand that we'll see people like that in every age and every generation. Those of you who spent time studying with people have seen that, maybe sometimes even in your own family. You see people that can get so extremely upset over religion, and even though they may have a Bible, it's not respected because what they've learned, what they've been taught, it's not Bible based. It means more to them than anything in the world. So one of the major areas of conflict had to do with truth versus tradition. There's another area in which we see human nature involved. Look at the book of Matthew, chapter 26, if you will. Matthew, chapter 26. In Matthew chapter 26, we have the occasion where Jesus is eating the Last Supper with the disciples. The Lord's Supper is instituted in verse 26 of that passage. And then in verse 30, Jesus makes a prediction of his denial. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter answered and said to him, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. Jesus said to him, surely I say to you that this night, when the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I'll not deny you. And so said all the disciples. Here on this occasion, now Peter and the rest of the disciples in the comfort, the safety of that upper room as Jesus is there with them. What happens afterwards? If you read the closing verses of Matthew chapter 26, you see what Jesus had promised comes to pass. Here, Peter, on 3 different occasions, when he's around people, when he's around a crowd, denies the Lord. it would be easy there, and it was easy to say, even if I have to die for you, I will, there with the Lord and the other disciples. But now he's out there in the battlefield. Now he's out there where the crowd is not sympathetic with Jesus, and so he's got a choice. Follow Christ, Lord, or the crowd. And so for those who think peer pressure is not an enormous thing to deal with, here's an example of how one of the Lord's own disciples, after spending 3 years with the Lord, was overcome by peer pressure. He got to the point where he would curse and swear and even deny the Lord being the Messiah. So here's another example, another area of conflict, whether that's going to be Jesus or the crowd. We mentioned this morning in one of the chapters of Matthew, you can read especially the book of John, how when Jesus made that triumphal entry, the crowd was with him. Hosanna. We saw how they laid down the palm tree leaves this morning. How they seemed like the whole town. In fact, it was the statement was made by some of the critics there. The whole world's going after him. That was the beginning of that week. By the end of the week, the cries of Hosanna had changed to crucify. That shows you how powerful a crowd can be. A crowd can change their mind, which they did, and a crowd can change your mind and mine. So down through the years, I'm sure you know, maybe even in your own life, there were times we didn't stand up in courage to the truth because of people that saw things differently, wanted to get along with them. You made the bad choice. And so another big issue that caused people to reject Jesus back then had to do with Christ or the crowd. Look at one more. If you will, turn with me to the book of John, chapter 18. Here's an example of another character that dealt with Jesus and didn't succeed in that dealing. John chapter 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, unless they should be defiled, that they might eat the Passover later on. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, I want you to notice his answer here. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause," notice what he says, "for this cause I was born, for this cause I've come to the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." Boy, that statement needs to be outlined in our Bible and in our mind. "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" When he said this, he went out again to the Jews, said to them, "I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" Then they all cried again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Chapter 19, verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know," as it's mentioned the second time, "that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him." For the third time, he makes a statement, "I find no fault in him." The Jews answered, "We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again to the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." And then the next verse, verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, for the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that's called the Pavement, but on Hebrew called Gabbatha. That was the preparation day of the Passover, and you know the rest of the story. Jesus goes to the cross. So as we see these three major areas of conflict, whether or not the Jews were going to follow the truth or tradition, we can see that they chose tradition. When it comes to Peter choosing Christ or the crowd, on that occasion that night, Matthew 26, he chose Christ. And here we find Pilate facing peer pressure in another way, whether or not he would follow his conscience or Caesar. There are people down through life, and myself included, where there may be occasions where you stand tall against a crowd of people. But everybody, I don't care who you are, there are people in life that you're close to. Might be a friend, it might be a boss, might be a family member, might be a spouse. They might be of a different religious persuasion. But when they stand up and say, "I don't agree with you," conflict rises. There's the temptation. What's it going to be? And that was the case with Pilate. He knew 3 times in the text the statement was made, "I find no fault in." He had the power because it was his job to judge situations like this, to find out whether or not someone was innocent or guilty. He had the power when he made that decision, when he knew that Jesus was innocent of the charges, to let him go. But he knew what the threat that was made. Caesar will find out. How would that look politically in Rome? To find out that Pilate allowed a man who claimed to be a king to let him go, that wouldn't fare well in Rome. So he yields to the pressure of the threat. Will go higher political appointment, basically, and you now are in position of a great threat. And Jesus goes to the cross. There have been times in the lives of people when someone close to them, someone in authority, someone that would say, "This is what I expect you to do, and you better do it," has caused some to yield to not follow their conscience and to do wrong. So the scriptures are so very helpful. We get to see time and time again when people are good examples of doing what's right. We get to see examples when people do wrong. We get to see successes. We get to see failures. We get to see steps taken to victory. We get to see steps taken to defeat. And all these provide learning examples of what to do and what not to do in life. And so we all, sooner or later, if we're not already, will face these same kind of conflicts. If Jesus were to come back today, we know what happened in Matthew chapter 27 when given a choice. What people chose then. If Jesus was to come back today, and we mentioned this morning, when Jesus came there after he had undergone that triumphal entry to Jerusalem, the first thing he did was to go to the temple and clean it out. That shows his righteous indignation. He knew what was going on, and now before his life would be over, he would go and make the grandest statement of all of what those people were doing and cleanse the temple, expose the hypocrisy and the guilt and the shame of those people there. he stood up and his life was taken from him. There may be times, not in our lifetime, but maybe down the road, as we see other examples of history back in the first century when Christians lost their life. There are people in our world today, I read an article coming over, how in some countries, those that are called Christians have been hunted down and killed because their faith in the hands of people who believe radically in some other far-fetched man-made religion. All these examples are there for us to be courageous or to be a coward. The choice is up to us. Tonight, if you're not a Christian, we give the opportunity to become one. The same issues that confronted those people then are the same issues that we face today. Have you done thus far with truth or tradition? Have you done thus far with Christ or the crowd? Have you done thus far with conscience or Caesar issues in your life? If you're not a Christian, you fail those things. But if you desire tonight to become a Christian, then you can make the right choice in courage and conviction, respond in humble obedience, and as the song suggests, bring Christ your broken life, and the blood that was shed can now be applied 2,000 years later to your heart and be cleansed. If you're a Christian that's laboring under problems, temptations, haven't done well, if you have the need for the prayers of the church, the help for the church, we're here for you. If you have a religious issue at all that can be helped by public response, we encourage you to take advantage of that right now. Together we stand and sing. Will you come?